The year was 66 AD, a time marked by turmoil and upheaval in the region of Roman Judea. The city of Caesarea Maritima, once a shining jewel and at the same time a symbol of decadence, stood as the imperial capital of this turbulent province. Its air, thick with the salty scent of the Mediterranean Sea, mingled with the exotic aromas drifting from bustling port markets and the stench of sewage flowing through narrow canals. Built by Herod the Great, Caesarea served as both a testament to his loyalty to Rome and a demonstration of his ambition, where Greek culture and Roman authority intertwined tightly with the enduring faith of the Jews. Yet, on this particular day, the fragile fabric of that complex unity was beginning to fray. Near the entrance to a local synagogue, an event unfolded that would ignite a spark capable of setting the entire region ablaze. A Greek man, a craftsman who owned a workshop nearby, stood defiantly on the ground belonging to the Jewish community. In an act of blatant mockery, he brought forth birds for sacrifice and butchered them over a cracked clay vessel, openly flouting the sacred laws of ritual purity that the Jews held dear. His act was not merely disrespectful, but appeared as a deliberate insult to their religious traditions, turning a solemn spiritual act into a street-side farce meant to provoke. To those assembled, it was more than an insult. It was a sacrilege, a blasphemy, a slap across the face of their God. The tension erupted instantly. Anger flared into furious arguments, which rapidly escalated into a physical altercation. The young Jewish men, their faces burning with righteous indignation, seized stones, ready to confront the offender. The Greeks, not willing to be outdone, responded with their own stones, and soon the small clash became an uncontrolled riot. News of this seemingly trivial confrontation, just some broken pottery and thrown rocks, spread across Judea with startling speed, like a wildfire racing through the dry steppe. But this was no ordinary dispute. It became the very spark that ignited a tinderbox filled for decades with humiliation, despair, oppressive taxes, prophetic hopes, and burning religious fervour. Few could foresee that this small spark would ignite one of the bloodiest and most devastating wars in the history of the Roman Empire, a conflict that would destroy hundreds of towns and villages, claiming the lives of over 1 million people. It was a war that would culminate in the destruction of the holiest site, the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, the spiritual heart and soul of the Jewish people, completely burned to the ground, reduced to ashes and rubble. To grasp the immense destruction and internal chaos that would eventually tear Judea apart, we must look back to a time when the flames of rebellion and despair had yet to fully ignite. The period of the 1st century AD in Judea was not a land of wilderness and neglect. It was a region steeped in millennia of history, a land of prophets and kings, where the faith in one invisible God had first taken root and gradually flourished. This faith was more than just a religion. It was the foundation of national identity, a principle that dictated how life was led and served as a wellspring of unwavering pride. The memory of past independence, of the glorious reigns of David and Solomon, and the heroic Maccabean revolt against Hellenistic oppressors lived vividly in every Jewish heart. Against this backdrop of deeply rooted national pride, Roman dominance was perceived as an unbearable insult. Officially, Rome had entered Judea not as an outright conqueror, but as a mediator, a referee settling disputes among the last of the Hasmonean kings. However, as often happened in history, the Roman eagle, once firmly perched, refused to loosen its claws. The golden age of this gilded captivity came under the rule of Herod I the Great, a ruler who governed from the year 37 BC until the year 4 BC. During his reign, Jerusalem saw incredible building projects, But Herod was also a figure of immense complexity, a titan of construction, and an astute politician. Herod's origins, a mixture of Idumean and Jewish blood, marked him as an outsider in the eyes of many. The Jewish populace regarded him as a usurper and a foreigner, a ruler installed by the sword of Rome, rather than by divine right. Despite this, Herod managed to maintain stability through impressive architectural feats, especially the grand expansion of the Temple Mount and the construction of various fortresses, demonstrating both his brilliance and his brutal consolidation of power. Yet, beneath these accomplishments lay a deep sense of unease, simmering resentment that would eventually explode centuries later, fueling the fires of rebellion and revolution. Throughout his reign, he skillfully flattered the city of Rome, calling himself a friend and ally of the Roman people, all the while attempting to win the love and loyalty of his own subjects. His most ambitious act, intended to immortalize his name and forge a sense of reconciliation with the populace, was the monumental rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. This project became one of the great wonders of the ancient world. Herod the Great transformed the modest, restored temple, originally rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, into a sprawling, magnificent complex of extraordinary beauty and grandeur. He significantly expanded the size of the Temple Mount, erecting massive retaining walls that still stand today, one of which is the renowned Western Wall, commonly known as the Wailing Wall. The temple itself was clad in gleaming white marble and adorned with gold, its roof shining so brightly under the sun that its brilliance was almost blinding. Herod's grand construction transformed not only the religious centre, but also the economic and national hub of Judea. The temple's treasury held not only sacred vessels, but also the state's wealth and debt records. Tens of thousands of priests and Levites served daily, performing countless sacrifices in reverence to God. 3 times a year, during the festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across the known world, arriving from Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, gathered in Jerusalem to worship the one true God in his earthly home. For the Jewish people, the temple was the axis of the universe, a sacred place where heaven and earth converged. Yet, despite this extraordinary feat of architecture and devotion, Herod's reign was not beloved by his subjects. The people saw that the splendor of the temple was financed through oppressive taxes, which weighed heavily upon them. They were aware of his paranoia and cruelty, how, out of fear of conspiracies, he had executed his own wife, Mariamne, and 3 of his sons. They also observed that around the temple he built pagan theatres, hippodromes, and fortresses, such as the formidable Antonia fortress, which towered over the Temple Mount as a stark reminder of who truly held power in Jerusalem. After Herod's death, his kingdom was divided among his sons, but their rule was brief and marked by incompetence. By the year of our Lord 6, Roman authorities lost patience. Judea, along with Samaria and Idumea, was merged into a single Roman province called Judea. No longer ruled by a client king, the region was now directly governed by a Roman legate, appointed from Rome, with the rank of prefect or later procurator. The new governor's residence was in Caesarea, but a Roman garrison was stationed constantly in Jerusalem. This marked the end of any semblance of independence that had remained. The very first act of this new administration was a census, conducted by the Syrian legate Quirinius, known in history as the Census of Quirinius. Its purpose was not merely to count the population, but to assess property for direct Roman taxation. For the Jewish people, this was the final straw. The census was seen not just as an economic measure, but as an act of sacrilege. The land of Israel belonged to God alone, and only he was to be honoured with tithes. Paying taxes to a pagan emperor, whose bust appeared on coins bearing the blasphemous inscription "Son of the Divine," was regarded as an explicit acknowledgement of his authority over them and over their God. It was, in essence, a form of idolatry. It was precisely in reaction to this census that a movement arose, one that would ultimately plunge Judea into decades of unrest and war. The era of Roman procurators began, a period characterized by widespread corruption, abuse of power, and mutual hostility. During the time of Roman rule over Judea, the empire often appointed officials of rather dubious reputation to govern this troubled province. Typically, these were corrupt, inept individuals, often saddlemen by profession, who viewed their position primarily as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than service or governance. Their tenure was marked by a series of provocative actions aimed at consolidating their authority and exploiting local resources. Among these officials, Pantheus Pilate, the most renowned thanks to the accounts found in the Gospels, became infamous for a particular act that sparked widespread outrage. He ordered the Roman legionaries to display standards bearing the image of the emperor within Jerusalem, an act considered blasphemous by the Jewish community, leading to mass protests and unrest. Pilate also misappropriated funds from the temple treasury to finance the construction of an aqueduct, further fueling dissent among the populace. Another governor, Gessius Florus, who ruled from the year 66 AD, was notorious for his greed and brutality, which directly contributed to the outbreak of the Jewish revolt. Florus openly looted cities, and he favoured bandits and robbers, sharing in their plunder, practices that only heightened the tension and hostility of the people. Every such act of provocation intensified the explosions of popular outrage, which the Roman authorities quickly suppressed through violent means. The Roman soldiers stationed in Judea, mainly conscripts from the neighbouring cities of Syria who were not Jewish, held deep contempt for the local population, their faith and practices. They eagerly participated in violent suppressions and punitive expeditions, further widening the growing chasm between the rulers and the ruled. The gap in understanding, respect, and empathy between the governing Romans and the Jewish people became ever deeper, plunging the entire society into profound disillusionment. As this abyss widened, so too did the loss of hope for a peaceful coexistence or reconciliation, making conflict seem inevitable. To grasp why a seemingly small spark, such as the one ignited by the incident in Caesarea, could unleash such fierce rebellion, it is essential to understand the soul of Jewish society in the first century. That society was not a monolithic entity united in thought or faith. Rather, it was deeply fragmented into a multitude of religious, social, and political factions, each holding divergent views about salvation, identity, and the future in this turbulent, ever-changing world. The primary sources that shed light on these diverse groups are mostly derived from the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, a participant and chronicler of the Jewish War. Josephus identified three major philosophical or ideological factions that shaped the spiritual and social life of Judea, and he also mentioned a fourth, ultimately the most radical of all. At the top of this social pyramid stood the Sadducees, a priestly aristocracy closely tied to the temple establishment. Their name likely derives from Zadok, the high priest during King Solomon's era. The Sadducees were the custodians of the temple's traditions and held considerable political and economic influence, rooted in their ownership of land and control of the temple cult. They were conservative in their religious outlook, recognizing only the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as authoritative and rejecting the oral traditions, interpretative laws, and numerous expansions developed by other groups. The Sadducees rejected the ideas of resurrection, angels, and divine predestination, believing instead that humans were solely responsible for shaping their own destiny through earthly actions. Politically, they were pragmatic and willing to cooperate with the occupying Roman authorities to preserve their privileges and the temple's sacred status. Their stance was one of maintaining the status quo. Any upheaval or war that threatened their position was fiercely opposed. The common people viewed them with suspicion and disdain, perceiving them as wealthy, arrogant, and somewhat morally lax, a self-serving elite disconnected from their spiritual duties. Opposing them in the hearts and minds of the people were the Pharisees, a group whose name likely means the separated. Unlike the aristocratic Sadducees, Pharisees belonged to the middle class, comprising scribes, teachers, small traders, and craftsmen. They gained widespread popular influence thanks to their religious devotion and emphasis on adherence to both the written and oral law. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, angels, divine predestination, and a moral code that extended beyond mere ritual observance to ethical and spiritual purity. Their teachings resonated deeply with the common folk, who saw in them a more accessible and promises-filled path to salvation amid the hardships of life under Roman domination. This complex tapestry of beliefs and social standings created a society rife with tension, yet also rich in diverse perspectives on how to best navigate the challenges of their world. Understanding the intricacies of these factions provides crucial insight into the explosive dynamics that ignited the Jewish revolt. Through the eyes of Josephus Flavius, we catch a glimpse of a society divided, each faction vying for influence and legitimacy, each harbouring hopes and fears that, in the end, would culminate in a clash that would change the course of history. Their strength did not lie in wealth or material possessions, but rather in their profound knowledge and understanding. The Pharisees, beyond the written Torah, also accepted and revered the oral tradition, firmly believing that Moses received not only divine commandments on Mount Sinai, but also oral explanations and clarifications from God himself. These oral teachings had been carefully transmitted from generation to generation, forming a vital part of their spiritual and legal worldview. The Pharisees were masterful interpreters of the law, dedicating themselves to applying its principles meticulously to every detail of daily life. For them, the concept of ritual purity was of utmost importance, serving as the central pillar of their religious practice and community identity. They held beliefs in the resurrection of the dead, in divine predestination, and simultaneously upheld the idea of human free will, seeing these ideas as interconnected facets of their faith. Their stance toward the Roman authorities was complex and nuanced, marked by a mixture of hostility and strategic restraint. While they despised pagan dominance and the oppressive rule of Rome, they refrained from openly inciting rebellion. Unlike radical reformers, they believed that submission to earthly rulers was necessary and justified, so long as divine intervention had not yet been granted to free them from foreign rule. Their approach was one of passive resistance, preserving their spiritual integrity through strict observance of the law, trusting that divine salvation would come in due time. From their ranks, the rabbinic Judaism of later centuries emerged, an enduring form of faith that survived the destruction of the Second Temple and adapted to new realities, ensuring the continuity of Jewish life through scholarly and religious resilience. Among the most mysterious and radical of Jewish groups were the Essenes, They took their pursuit of purity even further than the Pharisees, believing the official temple cult in Jerusalem to be corrupted by unworthy priests who had profaned its sanctity. Dissatisfied with the compromised religious authorities, the Essenes withdrew from the mainstream society altogether, establishing secluded communities in the wilderness. The most renowned of these was the settlement at Qumran, near the Dead Sea. It was at Qumran that, in the 20th century, archaeologists uncovered the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, an extensive library of sacred texts that provided invaluable insight into their beliefs and practices. The Essenes lived according to strict laws that governed every aspect of their existence. They practiced communal ownership of property, maintained vows of chastity, and dedicated much of their time to prayer, study, and labour. As ascetics and mystics, they anticipated an imminent end of days, eagerly awaiting a dramatic apocalyptic battle between the forces of light, embodied by themselves, and the powers of darkness, which included the Romans and the corrupt priesthood. Although they distanced themselves from active political participation, their apocalyptic worldview fueled a messianic fervour that reverberated throughout Judea. Their conviction that divine intervention was near intensified the atmosphere of anticipation and upheaval. As Josephus notes, a fourth philosophical movement emerged amidst this chaos, led by a man named Judas from Galilee. He instigated a revolt against the census conducted by Quirinius in the year 6 of the Common Era. These rebels, known as Zealots or the Zealots of the Law, were less a formal school of thought and more a fiercely political movement, pulling supporters from various social strata, predominantly among the impoverished farmers of Galilee. Theologically aligned in some respects with the Pharisees, they nonetheless arrived at radically different revolutionary conclusions. Their main cry was that they recognized no king apart from God. The Zealots rejected any allegiance to the pagan Roman emperor, refused to pay taxes, and disavowed Roman laws, considering such acts direct violations of the first and most essential commandment, loving and worshipping only one God. To them, any compromise with Rome was tantamount to betrayal and idolatry. They believed that divine assistance would come only if the people actively demonstrated extraordinary zeal, even if it meant fighting with weapons in hand to prove their faith and loyalty to God. Zealotry and religious fanaticism defined their worldview, where freedom was not merely a political concept, but a holy commitment requiring militant action. In the face of the brutal oppression and persecution, many believed that it was better to die fighting for their faith than to live as slaves under pagan idol worshippers. From the ranks of the Zealots, an even more radical and militant faction emerged, one that spread terror throughout the entire region of Judea. These extremists were known as Sicarii, a term derived from the Latin word seca, meaning short dagger, which they concealed beneath their garments for quick and lethal attacks. The Sicarii had perfected the art of urban guerrilla warfare, striking swiftly and unpredictably in the crowded streets of Jerusalem. During major festivals, when the city was teeming with visitors and pilgrims, they would melt into the throngs on the Temple Mount or in the marketplace, blending seamlessly with innocent civilians. Targeting mainly prominent Jews who were known collaborators with the Roman authorities, they would quietly approach from behind, deliver a fatal stab with their concealed dagger, and then vanish into the crowd. Often, to avoid suspicion, they would be the first to shout out or scream in fear, creating chaos and diverting attention away from themselves. Their primary goal was to instill widespread fear, paralyze the moderate factions, and make any form of cooperation with Rome impossible. The Sicarii did not shy away from kidnapping wealthy individuals to extort ransom or launching assaults on noble estates. They considered themselves revolutionaries, convinced that any means were justified in their pursuit of liberation. As a consequence, Judean society was like a boiling cauldron, filled with tension and unrest. The aristocratic Sadducees sought to maintain a fragile peace and order, fearing chaos. In contrast, the devout Pharisees called for spiritual resistance and adherence to the law as the true path to salvation. At the same time, ascetics awaited divine intervention, believing that heaven would soon send a miraculous solution. Meanwhile, zealots and ruthless Synagogue regarded the moment as ripe for action, ready to wield the sword in pursuit of their messianic hopes. All these factions contributed to the volatile atmosphere, which was intensely charged with messianic anticipation. Prophets and self-proclaimed messiahs appeared one after another, gathering crowds and promising miraculous salvation from Roman domination. The entire environment crackled with tension, and every spark, even the slightest, had the potential to ignite a massive explosion. One such spark ignited in Caesarea, quickly turning into a blazing wildfire of violence. After bloody clashes between Greeks and Jews in the provincial capital, the Roman procurator Gessius Florus made a fateful decision. Instead of punishing the instigators or restoring order, he exploited the treasury by demanding 17 talents of silver from the temple's holy sanctuary, under the pretext of collecting funds for the state. For the Jews, this act was perceived as the ultimate sacrilege, a theft of the sacred. The city erupted in fury. Crowds spilled into the streets, hurling curses at the Roman official. Mockingly, some began walking around with baskets, collecting alms for the poor Florus, as an act of defiance. Enraged, Florus responded by deploying additional troops into Jerusalem, allowing his soldiers to ransack homes and kill indiscriminately. This brutal repression only further inflamed resistance, transforming it into organized rebellion. The insurgents captured the Temple Mount, destroying the galleries connecting it to the fortress of Antonia in order to cut off the Roman garrison's access. It was during this critical moment that the radicals took a decisive step. A young, influential priest named Eleazar, the son of the high priest Ananias, who served as the commander of the temple guard, persuaded his subordinates to cease offering daily sacrifices for the health of the Roman emperor. Though seemingly a minor act, this move signified a declaration of war. The sacrifice for the emperor symbolized the Jewish acknowledgement of Roman authority, and its cancellation was an overt rejection of that authority. It was a clear and public statement that the Jews no longer recognized the rule of Caesar over their land, marking the beginning of a direct confrontation with the imperial power. A cautious and measured faction, which included the high priest Ananias himself, along with prominent members of the Idumean aristocracy, was horrified by what was unfolding. They desperately begged Eleazar to reconsider his decision, warning that his actions could spark a full-scale war capable of destroying both the city and its revered temple. Despite their pleading, their voices fell on deaf ears, and no one listened to their urgent warnings. Power in Jerusalem had shifted into the hands of the war party. Chaos erupted throughout the city as violence erupted in every corner. Zealots and Synagogue, led by a charismatic rebel named Menachem ben Yehuda, who was in fact the same Judean revolutionary known as Judas of Galilee, began hunting down anyone suspected of supporting peace or opposing the uprising. The fierce fighting culminated in the assassination of High Priest Ananias, a symbolic blow to the existing religious authority. In the wake of the violence, palaces and archives, which contained endless debt records and official documents, were reduced to ashes. This act was a calculated move designed to sway the poor and indebted segments of the population, encouraging them to join the rebels by destroying creditors' records and creating chaos in the financial system. Meanwhile, the Roman garrison, which had taken refuge within the fortified towers of Herod's palace, faced a brief and intense siege. Despite their brave resistance, they eventually surrendered on the very condition that their lives would be spared. However, once their weapons were lowered, the Roman soldiers, every single one of them, were mercilessly slaughtered. The only exception was the commander of the cohort, Metilius, who managed to escape by converting to Judaism and undergoing the ritual of circumcision, thus earning his life and acceptance into the Jewish faith. Simultaneously, a wave of inter-ethnic conflict swept across the land, spreading beyond Judea's borders. In key locations such as Caesarea, Scythopolis, and Ascalon, the Greek inhabitants launched violent pogroms, killing thousands of Jews in a brutal expression of ethnic tension. In retaliation, Jewish fighters struck back fiercely against Greek cities in neighbouring Syria and across the Jordan River. The Holy Land itself became soaked in blood, embroiled in warfare, mistrust, and devastation. News of this vast rebellion soon reached the ears of Caius Gallus, the Roman governor responsible for maintaining order throughout the entire region of Syria. His duty was clear: to restore peace and stability amidst the chaos. Gathering a formidable force, he mobilized the 12th Legion, known as the Lighting Legions, along with reinforcements from other legions and numerous auxiliary units supplied by allied kings. By the autumn of the year 66 of the Common Era, Gallus set out with his army, roughly 30,000 soldiers, toward Judea, intent on crushing the uprising and re-establishing Roman control. Initially, the military campaign seemed to follow the expected course. Gallus's forces systematically torched rebellious towns along their route, crushing resistance wherever they encountered it. After weeks of relentless fighting, they reached the outskirts of Jerusalem and established their camp on Mount Scopus, which offered a commanding view of the city. Following several days of brutal combat, Roman troops seized the northern suburbs and pushed closer to the formidable walls of the Temple Mount. They even began digging under the city's defences, preparing to set fire to the gates. Panic spread among the inhabitants. Many moderates, those who hoped for a peaceful resolution, were now ready to surrender. According to the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, if Gallus had pressed on with the siege for just a few more days, Jerusalem would have fallen. Yet, inexplicably and without clear reason, Caius Gallus issued an order to lift the siege and retreat from the city. The motives behind this decision remain subject to debate among historians to this day. Some speculate that Gallus feared his army would become cut off from its supply bases as winter approached, forcing a prolonged campaign in hostile territory. Others believe that Gallus overestimated the strength of the city's defenders or misjudged the resolve of the Jewish insurgents, trusting too much in the so-called Party of Peace within Jerusalem. Whatever the exact reason, this turn of events proved to be a disastrous mistake. For the rebels, the Roman retreat was nothing short of a miracle, seen as a divine intervention that emboldened their spirits to new heights. Their hope and confidence surged dramatically, and they immediately launched a pursuit of the fleeing Roman legions. What was meant to be a strategic withdrawal swiftly turned into a chaotic, panicked flight as the Roman army was overwhelmed. In the narrow passes leading toward Beit Horon, routes historically significant as the battleground where Joshua defeated the Canaanite kings, and simply where Judas Maccabeus once fought, the Jewish insurgents set a deadly trap. From hidden positions atop the surrounding heights, the rebels unleashed a barrage of arrows and stones upon the encumbered Roman columns. Their aim was to prevent any organised retreat, showering the fleeing soldiers with deadly projectiles and forcing them into disarray. The Roman legions suffered catastrophic losses, suffering terrible casualties amid the unrelenting assault. Their retreat turned into a humiliating, disorderly rout. In order to accelerate their retreat, Gao had no choice but to abandon everything: his entire camp, siege engines, and even his personal baggage. The 12th Legion, in their frantic escape, managed to commit a shameful act that would echo through history. They lost their eagle standard, the revered symbol of Roman valour. For Rome, this was more than a mere military defeat. It was an insult to the very soul of the nation. The loss of the legion's emblem embodied a deep national humiliation, a blow to Roman pride that resonated far beyond the battlefield. Gao, having fought valiantly, managed to bring back only the pitiful remnants of what had once been a formidable army, a force that had struck fear across the region. The triumph over Gao had enormous repercussions for the rebels. Their victory inflated their confidence and blurred their judgment. Even many moderates, including Sadducees and Pharisees, began to believe that victory was within their grasp, and more of them started to join the uprising. In Jerusalem, a temporary government was swiftly established to govern the rebellious territories. The country was divided into military districts, each overseen by a designated commander. In the strategically vital region of Galilee, a young priest and aristocrat, a man with some military experience, was appointed as the military leader. His name was Joseph ben Mattathias, widely known as Josephus Flavius. The rebels had seized Roman weapons and siege equipment, and they began minting their own coinage, inscribed with phrases like Shekel of Israel and Holy Jerusalem. It seemed as though the dream of independence was about to become a reality, tangible and within reach. However, Rome's perspective was fundamentally different. The humiliation of losing the eagle standard demanded swift retribution. Emperor Nero, despite his notorious extravagance and eccentricities, understood well that such a rebellion could not be left unpunished. He entrusted the task of crushing the revolt to a military commander rather than a politician or court official, one of the most capable generals he could find. This was a stern and seasoned veteran, not a young or inexperienced officer, one who had already earned fame in the conquest of Britain. Meanwhile, in Judea, a wave of euphoria was sweeping through the land as victorious triumphs bolstered pride among the rebels. Newly appointed leaders, basking in their fleeting power, began dividing authority and preparing for the inevitable next phase of war. Meanwhile, in Rome, decisions of a much broader scope were being made. Nero, upon learning of Gao's defeat and the loss of the eagle standard, was seized by fury, a tempest of rage that threatened to boil over. Yet beyond the theatrical display of anger lay a calculated mind at work. He was fully aware that Judea was not merely a rebellious province, it was a strategic linchpin, the gateway to Egypt, Rome's main source of grain and wealth in the east. The loss of Judea could ignite a domino effect of uprisings across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The war against the Jewish revolt had to be waged with seriousness and resolve. For this conflict, Rome needed not a court flatterer, but a true soldier, a commanding presence capable of restoring order. Nero's choice fell upon a man then in disgrace, whose reputation had suffered setbacks. His name was Titus Flavius Vespasian. Unlike the pampered Roman aristocracy, Vespasian came from modest beginnings, a Roman equestrian family with roots in humble occupations. His ancestors had been tax collectors and soldiers. This officer represented what was often called the new man, someone who had climbed the social ladder through talent and perseverance rather than noble birth. Vespasian was known for his straightforwardness, his frugality bordering on stinginess, and a sharp wit that often expressed itself in humour. But more than anything, he was recognised as an exceptional military strategist. His career had spanned the entire path of Roman military service. He had commanded the 2nd Augustan Legion during the invasion of Britain in the year 43, earning praise for bravery and tactical brilliance. He also fought in Germany, served as consul and proconsul in Africa, and understood well what war entailed, its hardships, its demands, and its brutal realities. His disgrace was the result of an almost humorous incident during one of Nero's artistic tours across Greece. Vespasian, perhaps exhausted or merely distracted, had the misfortune to fall asleep during the emperor's singing performance. The episode, trivial in itself, was enough to tarnish his reputation, at least temporarily, making him an unlikely candidate for a major military campaign at the time. However, Nero's decision to harness Vespasian's proven military prowess signified his recognition that, in the war to come, only a commanding, seasoned leader could restore Rome's prestige and suppress the rebellion that threatened her might and integrity. All former personal grudges had now been forgotten. The empire was in desperate need of its most skilled and capable general. Vespasian approached this daunting task with the relentless determination of a bulldozer, methodical, unwavering, and precise. He refused to repeat the mistake made by Cestius Gallus, who had naively launched a frontal assault on Jerusalem without careful preparation. Instead, Vespasian devised a plan that was both simple and ruthless in its execution. His strategy was to systematically eliminate resistance by gradually conquering the northern region of Galilee, thereby cutting off Jerusalem from its vital support bases. Once the northern territories were firmly in Roman hands, he intended to encircle and lay siege to the city itself. To accomplish this, Vespasian was granted enormous forces, an unprecedented deployment in Roman military history. He added the empire's 3 best legions to his strength, the 5th Macedonian, the 10th Prelatic, and the 15th Apollonian, along with numerous auxiliary troops and the forces of allied kings. The total number of Roman soldiers involved in the campaign soared to around 6,000 men. This marked one of the largest military formations assembled by Rome up to that point in time. Accompanying Vespasian to Judea was his eldest son, Titus, who was entrusted with command over one of the legions. By the spring of the year 67 AD, the Roman war effort was in full motion. Vespasian led his forces into Galilee, initiating a campaign that would soon turn into one of the most brutal and decisive phases of the Jewish war. In this turbulent region, the Jewish resistance was under the command of Josephus Flavius, who found himself in a desperate predicament. Despite his efforts to organize a defense, strengthening city fortifications, rallying local militias, and preparing for a protracted siege, his forces proved no match for the disciplined and overwhelming might of the Roman legions. The Galilean campaign was a foregone conclusion. The Roman armies moved with relentless brutality, employing scorched earth tactics that left no doubt about their ruthlessness. Villages were set ablaze, fields trampled underfoot, and anyone daring to oppose them was slaughtered without mercy. Towns and cities fell one after another, with resistance crumbling quickly before the advancing legions. The climax of this campaign was the siege of the city of Jotapata, where Josephus and his most loyal fighters had taken refuge behind formidable defences. The siege lasted for 47 days and became a symbol of resilience amid overwhelming adversity. Josephus provides a detailed account of this brutal programming. Jewish fighters launched daring sorties, pouring boiling oil and stones down upon their Roman besiegers. In turn, the Romans methodically built siege ramps, brought giant battering rams to the city walls, protected by protective shields known as tortoises, and launched devastating assaults using catapults and ballistas. Despite their fierce resistance, Jotapata eventually fell, and in the aftermath, a massacre unfolded. According to Josephus, around 40,000 people, including civilians and fighters, were slaughtered in the aftermath. Josephus and a small group of about 40 companions managed to escape and took refuge in a cave where they attempted to hide from the Roman soldiers. When the Romans finally discovered their hiding place, the defenders resolved to commit mass suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. They drew lots, deciding to kill those chosen before killing themselves. Miraculously, Josephus, by some stroke of luck, or perhaps through cunning planning, was the last survivor, remaining alive alongside one other warrior. He managed to persuade his companion to surrender, thus saving himself from death. This moment marked a turning point in Josephus's life, a pivotal event that would influence his future actions and writings. Instead of pleading for mercy upon being brought before Vespasian, Josephus chose to adopt a stance akin to that of an Old Testament prophet. He declared himself a messenger of God, claiming the divine inspiration to foretell that Vespasian and his son Titus would soon ascend to imperial power. Although Vespasian was somewhat superstitious and cautious, he was intrigued by this bold declaration. Recognizing the potential significance of this claim, he decided to spare Josephus's life, ultimately appointing him as an advisor and translator at his headquarters. From that moment, Josephus's fortunes would become intertwined with the fate of the Roman conquerors, shaping his legacy as both a chronicler and a figure of intrigue in the turbulent history of Judea. The commander leading the rebellion eventually transformed into a historian, observing the demise of his people from within a Roman camp. This pivotal event sparked a lasting debate among scholars and observers. Was Joseph, the leader, a traitor who saved himself at the expense of his people, or a shrewd pragmatist who understood the futility of relentless resistance and chose to preserve his own life so that he could survive to record and bear witness to this tragic history? Regardless of the differing opinions, it is thanks to him, through his diligent efforts and detailed accounts, that we know the story of the Jewish war in such comprehensive detail. By the end of the year 67, all of Galilee had fallen under Roman control. Tens of thousands of Jewish inhabitants had been slain, while even more were captured and sold into slavery. The Roman legions now stood on the very borders of Judea itself, and the path to Jerusalem was fully open to them. Yet, precisely at that crucial moment, news arrived from Rome that changed everything. These reports compelled the Roman general Vespasian to halt his campaign and shift his attention away from Judea for some time. An emerging storm was gathering across the empire, and it would, for an entire year, provide the Jewish rebels in Jerusalem with an unanticipated pause, a pause that they did not use to unify or strengthen their ranks. Instead, during this respite, driven by a frenzied and destructive rage, they turned on each other, engaging in bloody internal conflicts. It seemed as if the fate of Jerusalem was sealed. The iron fist of Vespasian was ready to crush the rebellious city beneath its weight. However, history is known for its unpredictable turns. In the year 68 AD, startling news arrived from Rome that shook the empire to its core. Emperor Nero, branded a menace to the state and forsaken by all, had taken his own life. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since the time of Augustus. With no clear heir to the throne, a fierce struggle for power erupted immediately. This tumultuous period, which would forever be remembered as the year of the four emperors, saw legions across different parts of the empire proclaiming various generals as the new ruler. Initially, Galba declared himself emperor, but he was soon replaced by Otho, who, in turn, was overthrown by Vitellius. Rome was plunged into chaos and civil war. Meanwhile, in Judea, Vespasian patiently waited. Recognized as one of the most capable and popular military leaders, his legions were prepared to support his claim. On the 1st of July in that same year, his armies in Egypt, and subsequently in Judea and Syria, proclaimed Vespasian as emperor. Leaving his son Titus to continue the campaign in Jerusalem, Vespasian travelled to Rome himself to stake his claim to the throne. By the end of that year, Vitellius's forces had been defeated, and Vitellius himself was killed. The Senate officially recognized Vespasian as the new emperor, establishing the Flavian dynasty. The chaos that engulfed Rome, however, granted the Jewish rebels in Jerusalem nearly 2 additional years of unanticipated breathing space. This was an invaluable gift of fate, a rare chance to unite their forces, bolster their defences, and prepare for a decisive confrontation. Instead of making use of this opportunity, the insurgents squandered it by turning inward and unleashing a bloody civil war among themselves. Their internal conflict, driven by fanaticism and madness, surpassed even the brutality inflicted by the Romans in its savagery. Jerusalem had become a battleground, a city torn apart by a deadly struggle among several fanatical leaders and their respective factions. The first of these was John of Gischala, one of the few surviving leaders after the destruction of Galilee. In a show of cunning, he fled the besieged city of Gischala and arrived in Jerusalem, where his eloquence and charismatic presence quickly elevated him to the position of a leading figure among the factions fighting for control. Josephus Flavius, a historian who personally knew and despised the figure in question, depicted him as a ruthless and unscrupulous tyrant, driven solely by an insatiable hunger for power and wealth. Meanwhile, John and his zealot followers had seized control of the outer courtyard of the temple, transforming it into their fortress of defiance. In opposition stood another faction, more radical and numerous, led by Simon, also known as Shimon bar Giora. Bar Giora was originally from Goriah and had begun his career as the leader of a band of brigands. Yet, despite his rough beginnings, he was inherently a born leader with messianic ambitions. He managed to rally around himself an extensive army composed of escaped peasants, slaves, and desperate outcasts, all promising them freedom and justice. To the impoverished masses, he became a symbol of hope and a representative of their yearning for liberation. In the spring of the year 69, after prolonged clashes with John's faction, Simon finally entered Jerusalem. He established his control over most of both the upper and lower parts of the city. By the time the Roman forces approached, the city was divided among 3 main factions, each engaged in constant conflict with the others. John from Gischala and his zealots held the Temple Mount, fiercely defending it. Simon bar Giora and his enormous army controlled a significant portion of the city, asserting their dominance. Meanwhile, within the inner courtyard of the temple itself, a third, even fanatical group, led by Eleazar, the son of Simon, had barricaded themselves. This faction had split from John and represented the most zealous segment of Jerusalem's defenders. As a result, Jerusalem had become a battleground where hostility and violence raged through every street. The city streets were littered with corpses, and combat raged on the walls, in the temple courtyards, and across the marketplace squares. Fighting between these factions even extended to the siege engines, some of which had been captured from the Cestius Gallus, used against each other in bitter battles. The most reckless and suicidal act of this internecine war, however, was the burning of the city's food depots. Jerusalem stored massive reserves of grain, oil, and wine, enough, according to Josephus Flavius, to sustain the city through several years of siege. Yet, driven by their madness and hostility, the factions of John and Simon deliberately set fire to each other's supplies. John burned the granaries located in the lower city to break Simon's supporters' resolve, while Simon, in a retaliatory strike, torched the storage facilities near the temple. By engaging in such destructive acts, they effectively sentenced their city to starvation, believing that depriving the population of essential supplies would force the inhabitants into desperate combat and eliminate the possibility of retreat or negotiation. It was an act of fanaticism bordering on madness, illustrating how deep the divisions and madness had become. When in the spring of the year 70, the Roman army, under the command of Titus, the heir of the new emperor Vespasian, approached Jerusalem's walls, the city was utterly exhausted, divided, and teetering on the brink of starvation. The rebels had, in a sense, already made the Roman army's task easier. They had inflicted severe internal damage and weakened the city from within. The Roman forces arrived during the Passover festival, a period when Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims trapped inside the city by ongoing warfare. Titus, young, ambitious, and eager for glory, led 4 legions, 3 of Vespasian's, and the infamous 12th Legion, seeking to redeem its disgrace by bloodshed, and a vast number of auxiliary troops, bringing the total force to over 70,000 soldiers. Among them was Josephus Flavius himself, no longer a prisoner, but a valued advisor. Jerusalem at that time was one of the most formidable and seemingly impregnable fortresses in the world, making the Roman siege an impossible feat of military endurance and strategy. The city had been safeguarded by the very forces of nature itself. It was perched atop a series of hills, ingeniously carved and protected by deep valleys that stretched along 3 sides. On the east, the Valley of Kedron; on the south and west, the Ginna Valley. Only to the north did the natural defences present a potential weak point, and it was precisely there that the most formidable system of fortifications had been constructed. The city's defences consisted of 3 concentric walls, each serving as a layer of protection and strategic barrier against invaders. The outermost, known as the Third Wall, had been erected relatively recently under the orders of King Agrippa I and was the strongest of the 3. Behind it stretched the Second Wall, which protected the northern neighbourhoods, effectively creating a second line of defence. The earliest, the First Wall, was the oldest and safeguarded both the upper and lower parts of the city, symbolising its ancient origins. Crowned atop all these defences was the Temple Mount, transformed into an impregnable fortress, with the citadel of Antoni abutting it on the northern side. According to the estimates of Josephus, the city's defences were designed to withstand a siege by approximately 25,000 insurgents. An external threat, such as a well-organised invading army, had momentarily forced the city's factions to put aside internal conflicts and unite against the common enemy. The Roman general Titus set up his camp on Mount Socus and began the relentless and systematic process of besieging the city, deploying the full might of the Roman military machine. His initial focus was the third external wall. Tens of thousands of legionnaires began constructing siege ramps and earthworks, massive earthen embankments called agger, that would allow them to crawl advancing siege towers and battering rams close to the city walls. To facilitate this effort, the woodland around Jerusalem was completely cleared, the trees cut down to provide necessary timber and materials. The defenders, the Judeans, launched desperate sallies in attempts to thwart the Roman engineers, attacking the siege works and forcing the Romans into fierce combat. Josephus vividly describes the incredible acts of bravery displayed by fighters on both sides of the conflict. During one such daring sortie, the insurgents succeeded in setting fire to the Roman siege engines, temporarily halting the construction work. However, despite suffering casualties, the Romans persisted with their effort, relentless in their determination. Within 15 days, a breach was finally made in the outer wall, allowing the Roman troops to surge into the northern suburbs of the city. Once inside, fierce fighting erupted over control of the second wall, which fell after only 5 days. The Roman forces now stood at the gates of the ancient city and the formidable fortress of Antonia. It was here that the resistance by the insurgents became fiercest and most desperate. Titus, intent on breaking their spirit quickly, resorted to brutal measures of terror. He ordered the public crucifixion of all prisoners and escapees, executing them openly along the walls of the city. Josephus records that as many as 500 victims were nailed to crosses each day, and soon the surroundings lacked enough trees or space to accommodate further executions. Yet, this horrifying spectacle did little to weaken the defenders' resolve. Instead, it only served to fuel their determination to resist to the utmost. In a final desperate stratagem, Titus decided to isolate the city completely, using a massive contravallation wall that was constructed around the entire circumference of Jerusalem. This formidable barrier, nearly 8 kilometers in length, was built with astonishing speed, an astounding feat of Roman engineering achieved in just 3 days. This new fortification sealed off the city entirely, cutting off any possibility of escape or external aid. The city, now encircled by an unbreakable ring of defences, found itself under complete blockade. The consequences of this blockade were devastating. Starvation set in almost overnight. The conditions within the besieged city surpassed all imaginable suffering. Josephus, observing the grim reality from the Roman camp, left chilling accounts of what transpired. All remaining supplies of food and provisions were seized by the bandit leaders, ruthless warlords, who rationed them solely among their own men. The innocent inhabitants faced imminent doom. In their desperation, they resorted to eating wild herbs, the leather from their sandals and shields, and even old straw or refuse. Homes filled with the corpses of women and children, victims of starvation and exhaustion, while the streets became rivers of dead bodies deprived of proper burial. The suffering was immense, and the city's terrible fate was sealed, a tragic testament to the horrors of siege warfare. In ancient times, bands of raiders would storm into homes, driven by relentless hunger and desperate for food. Their brutal searches aimed at finding even the smallest crumbs of bread, and they showed no mercy to anyone suspected of hiding provisions. The horror reached a terrifying peak with a gruesome story recounted by Josephus concerning a noblewoman named Maria. Overcome by starvation, she lost all sense of reason and committed an unspeakable act. She murdered, roasted, and consumed her own infant child. When word of her horrifying deed spread, even the Roman camp was struck with horror. According to the historian, Emperor Titus himself was shaken to such a degree that he swore by oaths in front of the gods that he bore no responsibility for what had happened. The city was devouring itself from within, torn apart by hunger and chaos. While Jerusalem succumbed to starvation and despair, the invading Romans pressed on with their relentless conquest. They erect formidable new fortifications and even more heavily armed ramparts directly opposite the fortress of Antonia. After days and nights of fierce, unyielding assaults, the fortress finally fell into Roman hands. Now, the legions stood before the Grand Temple itself, an ancient monument of sacred significance that had stood for generations. It was the last stronghold, the final bastion of resistance, the ultimate battlefield. Even in the face of inevitable defeat, the defenders' zeal remained unbroken. They clung to the hope that divine intervention would save their sacred sanctuary, that God would perform a miracle, sending angels to destroy the pagan invaders and protect his holy house. Their last stand was characterized by a furious, almost frantic defense, turning the temple courts into a bloody arena of slaughter, with combat raging for every arch and staircase. The Roman soldiers suffered heavy losses, but relentless fighting persisted. Then, on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Evi, corresponding to the end of August in the year 70 AD, a catastrophic event unfolded. Ironically, this date marked the anniversary of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Solomon's first temple some 6 centuries earlier. According to the official account recorded by Josephus Flavius, Emperor Titus did not intend to completely destroy the temple. He supposedly recognized its cultural and architectural significance and aimed to preserve it as a monument of Rome's greatness. A military council was convened, and the decision was made to storm the temple with force, but refrain from setting it aflame. Yet, amidst the violence of the assault, when Roman soldiers, enraged by stubborn resistance and mounting casualties, penetrated the outer courtyard, an incident occurred that sealed the temple's fate. One legionary, climbing onto his comrade's shoulders, snatched a burning torch and hurled it through an opening into a chamber near the sanctuary. The wooden structures, heated from the summer heat, ignited instantly. Flames erupted with incredible speed, swiftly spreading throughout the entire complex. Titus himself was said to have rushed to the scene, shouting commands to extinguish the fire, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos of the battle and the roar of burning timbers. Instead of halting the blaze, many soldiers, driven by greed and bloodlust, took advantage of the chaos to set fire to the remaining structures from different sides. They knew full well that the temple housed unimaginable treasures, and that the destruction of this sacred site would bring them immense wealth. The grand building was transformed into a colossal funeral pyre, engulfed in destructive flames. Josephus describes this scene as apocalyptic. With the temple engulfed in fire, no one could help but cry out or mourn. The deafening roar of the consuming blaze mixed with the cries of those collapsing in fear and pain. It seemed as if the entire mountain, from its very foundations, was boiling in chaos. Blood flowed like a river, and the number of those killed far exceeded the casualties among the attackers. Thousands of people who had sought refuge within the temple perished in the flames, burned alive. Many priests, preferring death over defilement of the sacred place, threw themselves into the inferno voluntarily, choosing to die rather than see their holy sanctuary desecrated. When the flames died down, the victorious Roman soldiers raised their banners, bearing their majestic eagles over the smouldering ruins, symbols of their conquest, and performed offerings to honor them. This marked the official declaration of Titus as the new emperor, a recognition cemented by their victorious siege. Immediately following this, a systematic plundering of the city began. The sacred treasury within the temple was hastily emptied. Golden menorahs, the pedestal for the bread of offering, silver trumpets, all of these precious relics were carried away by the victors, symbols of religious devotion and cultural heritage. With the fall of Jerusalem, the war appeared to be effectively over. However, even after the destruction of the Holy Temple, resistance in the upper city persisted for about a month longer. By that time, it was increasingly clear that this was but a final gasp, a desperate dying struggle. Once this last enclave was finally captured, Titus issued meticulous orders to wipe Jerusalem from the map, leaving behind only a few remnants, a handful of towers from Herod's palace, serving as evidence of the formidable fortress that the Romans had managed to conquer, and a section of the city walls that the 10th Legion used as their military camp. The rest of the city was reduced to rubble, a vast wasteland of ruins. According to the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, during this war and its ensuing siege, approximately 1 million people perished, most of them civilians caught in the brutal conflict. Nearly 97,000 others were taken captive. Their fates varied. Some were chosen for triumphant displays in Rome, paraded as spoils of war. Others were sent to endure hard labour in Egyptian mines, yet others were sold into slavery. Thousands faced gruesome deaths in arenas across the empire, devoured by wild beasts and savage spectacles. Leaders of the rebellion, such as John of Giscala and Simon Bar Giora, were captured hiding in underground hideouts. John was condemned to lifelong imprisonment, while Simon, regarded as the chief culprit, was brought prisoner to Rome. In the year 71, Vespasian and Titus celebrated a grand triumph in the imperial capital, commemorating their victory over Judea. The parade was immense. Treasure taken from the destroyed temple was displayed, and at the end of it, Simon Bar Giora was marched in chains, a symbol of the rebellion's collapse. He was led to the Capitoline Hill, where he was ritually executed by strangulation in the Mamertine prison. In memory of this victory, the Romans erected the famous Arch of Titus. Its intricate friezes vividly depict Roman soldiers carrying the menorah and other treasures stolen from the destroyed temple, serving as a testament to their triumph. For the Jewish people, this arch became a powerful symbol of their greatest national tragedy. Though Jerusalem had fallen, the war was not yet entirely over. Isolated groups of zealots continued to resist in the most inaccessible fortresses within the Judean desert. The last major stronghold was Masada, a rocky fortress on the edge of the Dead Sea, where a band of Sicarii rebels, led by Eleazar ben Yair, had taken refuge. The siege of Masada, occurring in the years 73 and 74, became both a heroic and tragic conclusion to the entire conflict. The Roman legate Lucius Flavius Silva led the assault, constructing a formidable siege wall around the mountain and a massive ramp to bring a battering ram close to the walls. As the fortress faced inevitable fall, Eleazar ben Yair delivered a moving speech to his companions, urging them to prefer death over slavery, to die as free people rather than submit to Roman captivity. In a dramatic act of collective resistance, nearly 1,000 defenders, men, women, and children, committed mass suicide. When the Romans finally breached the gates, they encountered only silence, a grim testament to their foes' unwavering spirit. Thus, the Great Jewish War came to an end. The repercussions for the Jewish people were catastrophic and fate-changing. The destruction of the Second Temple marked a pivotal moment in Jewish history, signifying the end of an entire era and shaping the course of their collective destiny for centuries to come. With the destruction of the temple, the elaborate system of sacrifices that had served as the spiritual and religious core of the Jewish people came to an abrupt end. Consequently, the entire priestly aristocracy, those who had wielded authority within the temple, disappeared as well. Among them were the Sadducees, a high-ranking priestly class closely associated with temple rituals, and the Zealots, a radical militant faction committed to freeing Jerusalem from foreign domination by force. Yet, despite this profound loss, Judaism as a faith did not perish. Instead, it underwent a significant transformation. In times of national catastrophe and upheaval, the leadership shifted from the sacerdotal elite to the Pharisees. These scholars and teachers, whose teachings were not tied to a specific location, but centered on the study and observance of the law, proved to be the most resilient and adaptable. According to legend, during the period of despair, one of the greatest sages of that era, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, during the destruction, instructed his students to carry his body out of Jerusalem in a coffin as if he had already died. His goal was to approach the Roman authorities, either Vespasian or Titus, and request only one thing: permission to establish a small academy in the town of Yavne for the study of the Torah. The Romans, perceiving this as a benign activity suitable for a handful of elderly scholars, granted the request. From that modest beginning, a new form of Judaism took shape, rabbinic Judaism that endures to this day. The center of religious life then shifted from the once dominant temple to the synagogue and yeshiva, institutions dedicated to communal prayer, study, and spiritual reflection. The sacerdotal priesthood was replaced by the rabbi as the spiritual teacher and spiritual authority. Instead of sacrifices and blood offerings, the focus turned to prayer and the meticulous study of sacred texts. Through this transition, Judaism was essentially transformed from a temple-based religion into a religion of the book, a shift that allowed it to survive for centuries in exile and dispersion across the globe. The Jewish diaspora, which had already existed before the temple's destruction, grew dramatically in the subsequent years, especially as tens of thousands of captives and refugees were scattered across different regions. For many decades, Jerusalem ceased to be the center of Jewish life and authority. After the revolt led by Bar Kokhba, which lasted from 1332 to 1335, the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the province of Judea to Syria Palestina in an attempt to erase its Jewish roots. On the ruins of Jerusalem, he constructed a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, and he forbade Jews from entering the city under pain of death. The impact of the temple's destruction was devastating not only for Judaism, but also for Christianity, which at that time was still considered a sect within Judaism. The loss of the temple had profound consequences for the nascent Christian community as well. It marked a definitive separation from traditional Jewish temple practices and accelerated the process by which Christianity evolved into an independent universal faith, openly welcoming all nations. The history of the Great Jewish Revolt is a tragic tale of how the collision between two irreconcilable worldviews, the pragmatic imperialism of Rome and the religious absolutism of Judaism, led to catastrophe. It reveals how blind fanaticism, messianic expectations, and internal conflicts among the Jewish people themselves could bring about their collective self-destruction. Yet, it is also a story of extraordinary resilience, of a nation that, despite losing its land and its most sacred sanctuary, found the strength to endure and preserve its faith, carrying it through to future generations across the centuries. The blaze that engulfed the temple in 70 CE marked the end of an era, yet in its glowing embers was already flickering the dawn of a new world, a world in which the faith of the Jewish people would adapt, survive, and influence the course of history, one that continues to this day. Thank you for dedicating this time to delve into one of the most dramatic and pivotal chapters of world history. If this journey into the past has resonated with you, it is worth engaging more deeply with such stories that reveal the complexity and resilience of human faith and history. Your appreciation serves as the most meaningful reward for the effort and dedication you invest.